and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And with me, Gareth Tennant.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And I've realized every week we read that out. And didn't we decide that you're never a former Royal Marines officer? You're never a former Royal Marine. You're always a Royal Marine. Once a Royal Marine, always a Royal Marine?
I mean, that's the saying. I think I find it more offensive when people say I'm an ex-Royal Marine. Former kind of implies that, I don't know, yeah. I mean, I am still a Royal Marine in my heart. I just don't actively put uniform on and go to work to do Royal Marine stuff every day.
Well, you know what? So, sorry, I was reading through that, and you read something every week and then you realize, hang on a minute, we've had this discussion. Anyway, that's not the point. This week is another one of our influencers, and we have certainly bounced around over our influencers series. For those of you who perhaps are coming across this because the name popped up on the internet or on your stream and you thought this seems interesting, we really have gone all around the houses, from Rommel, talking about Rommel, which I particularly enjoy, through to Taylor Swift. Who else have we done, Gareth?
Dolly Parton.
Winston
Churchill.
Machiavelli. We've done Donald Trump. Today, I think we're returning to our military heritage. And I think this is an interesting one because it relates to something we have done recently, and I can never keep track of when we send these out, but we have recently been lucky enough to be invited and visit RAF Cranwell, and specifically the TEDA Academy, the Leadership Academy for the RAF. And so, Gareth, who are we covering that is relevant potentially to that visit today on our Influencers episode?
Yeah, it absolutely is relevant. So we are doing Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Arthur William Tedder, 1st Baron Tedder, GCB, who, as this episode goes out, hopefully immediately after 2 episodes from the Tedder Leadership Academy at Royal Air Force Cranwell, which I think is very aptly named, as hopefully we're about to find out why Tedder was uniquely brilliant, I think, as a leader in wartime Britain and post-war as well, because he is an Air Force officer who shaped a lot of current thinking, and certainly throughout the First World War, Second World War, and post-war era, thinking about the role of air power, but also was a very joint officer and joint leader. And by joint, what I mean is thinks about the relationship between air, land, and maritime forces. And now in the modern era, we have to start including things like space and cyber forces, but obviously back in the wartime era, when Tedder was Marshal of the Royal Air Force, we're talking about the integration of air, land, and maritime power.
Isn't it? So he's one that is interesting, which is, I know the name, I know a very small amount about Tedder, but it strikes me that he is to some degree overshadowed by some of the other names from the Second World War. And of course, there are a significant number of illustrious names. But if you said name someone from the RAF, I suspect people would say Douglas Bader or Bomber Harris, and perhaps Tedder wouldn't be on their list, which is fascinating given that the leadership centre for the RAF is named after him. That perhaps gives you a sense of how the RAF views Tedder and his impact and his legacy on the RAF.
Yeah, I think a hugely underrated wartime leader. Perhaps because he ended up as the deputy Allied commander under General Eisenhower. But I think that's interesting. He was the most senior military commander of the British, in that he was the deputy commander of the Allied SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Expeditionary Force Europe, under Eisenhower. And we'll talk about why that happened. He then went on to lead, as Marshal of the Royal Air Force, the post-war Air Force, and did a huge amount to reshape the Air Force at a time where air power was moving from the massive changes we'd seen through the Second World War into the nuclear age, into the Cold War. But more importantly, I think he showed a level of pragmatism, diplomacy, and strategic thinking that nearly outshines all military leaders in the Second World War. There are notably some contenders that we could talk about, Eisenhower perhaps being one of them, but I think far outshines Montgomery.
Well, I was going to say Montgomery and Patton, who you might. We've had this before where we've talked about Eisenhower, and the challenge with Eisenhower is he isn't, even though he outranked all of them, and in fact even outranked Tedder in this case, people don't naturally necessarily think of Eisenhower. They think of Montgomery and Patton as the two gung-ho leaders. And yet what you've explicitly said, and that hadn't registered with me, is those two officers, in a sense, reported through Tedder. He was senior to them, which is fascinating.
Yeah. And I think Eisenhower is really interesting. We should probably do an influences episode on Eisenhower as well, because he obviously came through the ranks extremely quickly and promotes and overtakes a lot of the senior wartime leaders to become the Supreme Allied Commander. Tedder started the Second World War already as a very senior Royal Air Force officer. But it's probably worth us going back. So Arthur Tedder, born in 1890, and so comes of age at about the beginning of the First World War. So he is a Cambridge man. So he's from a reasonably well-off family, upper middle class, but not like Churchill, born into nobility. He's a Cambridge man, so he's not an idiot. He only gets a 2-2 at Cambridge. So, and I haven't had time to dig into, whether that's because he's not an academic or because he was focused on other activities. I genuinely don't know. But he is a strategic thinker, and later in life goes back to the world of academia, and proves that he is, very, very capable.
I think as long as he, during the First World War, escaped from a tower, crossed occupied Germany dressed as a washerwoman, we're all good. And by the way, for anyone wondering about that reference, you need to go back and listen to multiple of our other influencers, where apparently in the Second World War, that was the thing that was a signal that you're a great leader to come. So de Gaulle's great challenger, and I think Rommel as well, all of these people escaped prisoner of war camps either during or after the First World War. So don't ruin it yet, but I'm really hoping there's an escape story in there.
So there isn't, I'm afraid, but he does end up promoting because somebody else gets captured, and we'll talk about that later on. So there is a tenuous link to people ending up in prisoner of war camps. Early on, before the First World War, he spent some time in Germany. He had obviously seen the writing on the wall. He wanted a career as a diplomat or in the diplomatic service, and therefore, in 1912, spent some time in Germany. And then he joined the colonial service, and I think was sent out to somewhere in South Pacific. I
I
want to say
believe
Fiji.
Fiji. You are
Oh,
correct in
okay,
Fiji.
cool.
I'm doing real time research as we
Oh,
go.
yeah, okay,
I
you're
believe it is
googling as we
Fiji.
go, are you? So I'm doing this from memory, but he either didn't get on with it or didn't enjoy it or didn't like the posting, but for whatever reason, the First World War breaks out, and he uses that as an opportunity to come back and enlist in the army.
Of course,
And
no RAF.
there's no Royal Air Force, and at this point, he shows no inclination to want to fly, or he joins the Dorset Regiment, which is now or was the Devon and Dorset Regiment, now part of the Rifles, I believe. He gets injured before he's able to mobilise and go to France, and therefore requests a transfer into the Royal Flying Corps. Now, I don't have any evidence to substantiate this, but my gut is he wasn't a particularly driven by the idea of flying. He was driven by the idea of doing something active, you know, seeing action, and his injury precluded him from the infantry, and therefore this seemed like a good route to doing something active. I don't know that that's the case, but that's my gut feeling about him. He joins the Royal Flying Corps, and as many young men did during the First World War, promotes quite quickly, ends up being a squadron commander. Obviously, early days of the Royal Flying Corps, there is no such thing really as fighters and bombers. There's just planes. But by the end of the war, there is, and there starts to be fighter squadrons and bomber squadrons. And he ends up flying bombers and commanding a bomber squadron. And then he goes to the Middle East, but I could be wrong. But
He
he's
does. Can I
somewhere
see?
as this.
This is the danger of doing so. As you can tell, this is one of Gareth this time, so I get to enjoy myself and listen and
Mm,
learn along with the rest of the audience. Here you go. You almost certainly won't have this detail, but I've just found this in front of me. Do you know where he learned to fly?
no, no, I don't.
He learned to fly less than 10 miles away from where we record Battling with
Oh, it's
Business.
in Reading.
He learned
Yes,
in Reading, in the number one school of aeronautics in Reading. How about
I
that?
do remember reading
He
that.
has
Yes.
a connection.
He ended up in Egypt, running the School of Navigation, and I think they do targeting as well. So he's got a history in bombing, and this is at a point where the Royal Flying Corps is sort of working out how air power works. You've got to protect aircraft in the sky with other aircraft, dogfighting, but ultimately it's about spotting targets, what we would call surveillance and reconnaissance today, and it's about affecting targets, dropping bombs. And that's clearly, the most effective use of air power at the time. He goes to the Navy Staff College, and I think that's really interesting. And he he showed early on a real interest in understanding the wider system of how the military operates. And he volunteered to go to Navy Staff College. And considering that he joined the army, he'd spent all of his time in the Royal Flying Corps, you would have thought he would be focused more on air-land integration and how air power could be used to shape land battles, as most of the Royal Flying Corps were. But he decided to go and study naval power
That
at Staff College.
that seems really, I don't know, but that strikes me as very unusual. One of the things I've learned over a number of years, whether I was in the service or I have friends in the service, is that there is a fierce pride of your own service. There is a rivalry, but there is often that extends into, well, of course, we do it the right way. You only have to look at who should have the aircraft right now. For many years, there was a debate that the Royal Navy didn't need aircraft because the RAF should fly them and vice versa. And the Army said, well, of course, the idea that someone back in the 1920s would say, I am interested in a service I am not a part of, that has to be quite unusual, given also at that time people's affinity to regiments, as in it was a big deal which bit of the military you went to, because typically there was some tie or connection to it. So that's really
Yeah.
interesting, as you
It
say, where he's got experience now, genuine and connections across all those services.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think it shows something we've talked about before, which is this idea of curiosity, thinking beyond what you're used to, thinking beyond what you do in the organisation, but trying to work out how it connects into that wider system. I think is a really important factor in being able to think strategically, and I think TEDA shows this curiosity and this wanting to know how we can improve and how we can do things better. Interestingly, though, in his diaries, he talks about how disappointed he is with the Navy. And it's not a parochial, I've spent my time in the Royal Flying Corps, I'm now in the Royal Air Force, look how terrible the Navy are. He's disappointed that Naval Staff College is all about naval warfare, and they don't really touch on the power of air power or how the Navy supports land operations or vice versa. And he comes away thinking that the Navy's quite parochial and that they don't understand corporately or sort of culturally as an organization, they don't understand the power of this emerging capability, which is air power. He, I think, later in life ends up writing one of the official histories of the Royal Navy. So that link and that curiosity doesn't disappear.
I suspect what we would find if we were there is that the bulk of the military has this sort of tribal view, and then there are a few people on the edges that have this unusual curiosity. Here's a fact that I learnt, which is, it was for some research I was doing, which is the assumption the first major naval air attack in history, most people foolishly suggest that it's Pearl Harbor, and then British people who in the know laugh at them and say, of course, you're wrong. It was Taranto, where we had a decisive attack in the Second World War at the Battle of Taranto and sunk a number of Italian battleships and certainly significant influence. Well, that's not right either, because there was naval air power projected in the Mediterranean before Taranto. The point I'm getting to is all of that is wrong. The first naval strike power was from an aircraft carrier during the First World War on Zeppelin sheds in Belgium. And so this idea of the power of the bomber and this idea of an unusual branch projecting power in a way that no one would have anticipated, there were already the seeds there. So I wonder whether he was familiar with these bomber attacks or these air attacks. And there was this sort of line of curiosity amongst perhaps a small number of people to say, I wonder how we could combine these things to
Yeah.
create a different way of thinking.
I think he almost certainly would have been aware of these things. And even if he's not, he's already thinking about the combinatorial power of using air power to support land operations and maritime operations and vice versa, using land capabilities to support air operations. And what's interesting is, so he ends up effectively spending most of the interwar years moving into the training, doctrine training, and policy world, and thinking quite deeply about air power and teaching it. Um, and he's in a series of roles in various schools, but then in the late 30s, he ends up taking command of the Royal Air Force operations out in the Middle East, and then latterly in the Mediterranean. And during that time, if you think about a pilot taking command of an Air Force operational area, then you can imagine them sort of looking at maps and charts and looking at where they can deliver strike packages and how they can use air power to have devastating effect on the enemy and all of this kind of good stuff. And there's the cliche of pilots, giving hand gestures and talking about flying, wonderful flying.
By the way, that's not a cliche. Literally, I was at a party this weekend where hands were used. So
it is very true, I have to say. But Tedder spends most of his time looking at the logistical enablement system of how an overseas expeditionary air force works. And there was a really interesting quote from a guy called Air Vice Marshal Johnny Stringer, who is a retired air marshal who, very, very distinguished career, talking about Tedder and how he strategically thinks. And he made the point that in the North African operations, Tedder probably understands recovery and sustainment of a force over the ground more than the army does. And in terms of recovering broken down aircraft, getting them back to where they can be cannibalized, used for parts, refitted, and then pushed back to the forward area of the battle, he is driving a new way of thinking about how air power projection works. And we've talked about this in the podcast before. Amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. Tedder is the embodiment of this at this time where he's running air operations in the Middle East and then in the Mediterranean. He knew how to do it. Johnny Stringer talked about it being, better than the army, but it was certainly better than the Luftwaffe. And so
there's something I want to go back to, which again, part of this is to trying to find these rhythms with the different influences. We've got another person who spent a significant amount of time thinking about things.
Yeah.
And you might argue the names and the leaders that we're more familiar with are those who we remember doing things. And so maybe there's a hint there about why Tedder's name maybe isn't as familiar as others. Well, there's a question. Do you think the British military and any other militaries you've come across today still have that facility for thinking versus we don't have enough people and so therefore they're doing, and any spare time, sure, if you want to do some thinking. And the second piece for me was, you've heard me say this before, most organizations I've been in, particularly sort of the medium-sized ones, maybe not so much the very large ones, the idea that there are roles where people aren't responsible for building a thing or doing a thing, and they are strategy, that seems to be an unusual activity. And I think there is a stigma almost that all these people do is just sit and think, and in the civilian world, write presentations. Let's go back to the question about the British military. Is there time for people to go through a period of their career and not think is the wrong word, but have a sustained period where you can develop ideas and doctrines in a safe way?
Yeah, I think there is. We went to the Centre of Army Leadership. We've just come back from the Tedder Leadership Academy. We've talked about various staff colleges. These are academic institutes for studying war, from which middling officers to senior officers spend extended periods of their career, maybe 1 year, 2 year postings, learning, studying, discussing, thinking. I think what's interesting, though, is, and this isn't perhaps a military trait, this is perhaps just a trait of human nature. We tend to give credence to people who've done things, they've experienced things, rather than people who theorize about things. So there's this kind of assumption that you can think about a problem, but until you've experienced it for real, you don't really know how it actually works. You don't know the detail. You can, and there's a relatively sort of, I think less so these days, but disparaging view of academics who look at the study of war from military officers who've experienced war. And there's this kind of idea of, well, you can read a lot of books, but until you've actually been under fire, you don't know what it's like.
Both of those things can be true.
Yes. And I think that's the point. And I think the counter argument is to say, you can experience things and you can have that emotional, visceral understanding, but until you have the time to reflect back, analyze your experience, analyze the experience of others, and tie it into the reading, the academic, robust analysis, you're just really telling war stories. And the opposite is true. If you're just an academic, then you're just theorizing. And I think where you see people who do both, and there's a phrase that comes up over and over again in the military, which is the idea of a warrior philosopher. Somebody that is active, does things, shows physical courage, but also has the intellect and character to reflect, be humble enough to continue to learn, to adapt, to take their experience and to look how it applies in a slightly different condition or a slightly different situation. And I think that's the right balance. And I think that's probably a general rule in any organization and any walk of life is if you can combine the curiosity to learn, to reflect, with the curiosity to go and experience, then you're going to be in a far better place to make decisions and to talk about how things work.
Well, there's a few. The first thing is it makes me smile. I think we've beaten this one to death, but of course you're just describing diversity. If you had someone who's only ever done it, that doesn't represent diversity. If you've had someone who's only ever thought about it, that isn't diversity. If you can mix those two things together, you've got a winner. I do think it's important to say, and having experienced this through my life, is there are lots of reasons why the warrior philosopher makes people nervous. The first reason is because the philosophy piece is very intangible. And not only that, but the philosophy piece can be wrong for a long. You might be thinking about stuff, and you might spend 5 years to come up with the wrong answers. And so there's lots of reasons, particularly in a resource-constrained organization, civilian ones, as we've discussed multiple times, being those where would we like to hire someone who's going to think about stuff? So last year they led a business unit. This year we're going to give them 6 months to think about how we might develop the business thing. Maybe there's a final piece in here, which is, let's assume that you broadly agree that this balance brings value. One thing we haven't talked about is you need the courage of leaders to invest scarce resources on the possibility that the people will pay off, because half the philosophers will be saying, we shouldn't do anything. This is great. What we do today is fantastic. It's then the other. So it's an interesting thing, which is the courage of an organization to say, I'm going to spend scarce resources and I know that half of it will be nonsense that I'll get at the other end. But it's the cleverness of finding the half that works and recognizing that.
I think Arthur Cheddar is a really good example of where this works well. So let's just reflect back for a minute. He's gone through infantry training. He's worked in the diplomatic service, in the overseas as part of the colonial service. He's been through flying training. He's then studied the use of air power. He's been to the Naval Staff College and looked at naval tactics more broadly, naval power more broadly. And now he's been through a whole series of training jobs, many of which have been largely about thinking about the problem set and teaching it. And I think it's worth just pointing out that staff colleges are both training and teaching establishments But like any academic institute, they are also research institutes. They are organizations that recognize that they can't stand still and are constantly researching, developing, writing, reading, debating. And so I think he's got this really nice balance at this point in his career of being a middling to senior officer. He's not in the sort of strategic level in terms of command. He's I don't know what rank he is at this level actually, but he's probably group captain-ish, wing commander, group captain level, but has a very rich and varied background in training and in operational experience. The war breaks out, and he is commissioned to look at national aircraft production. And this is interesting because who's the armaments minister?
Beaverbrook.
He doesn't get on with Beaverbrook. And I have to be honest here, I don't know anything about Beaverbrook other than the fact that he was the armaments minister. But he doesn't get on with him, and therefore he's moved on. And that could have been Tedder's fault. It could have been Beaverbrook's fault. It could have been 6 and 2 3s. I have no idea. But for whatever reason, clash of personalities, and he's moved on. But because he didn't get on with Beaverbrook, this is the first time that Churchill really gets to know the name Arthur Tedder. I don't think he got to know him personally, but doesn't look upon him favourably. And this is where I said earlier, it's by luck that somebody else gets captured, but he is made officer commanding of the Air Force in the Middle East. Otherwise, it was going to be somebody else. And this is where he learns, he studies, learns, practices, relearns, and continues to develop how sustainment and enablement and recovery works at an operational level, and far outstrips the Luftwaffe in being able to keep aircraft flying. So per aircraft, RAF aircraft are flying more hours, more effectively, and they're having a more decisive effect. Before we even start to talk about whether they should be targeting, tactically to support ground forces or strategically to destroy the will of the people, or try to operationally take out the support systems. And I've deliberately kind of brought that up because this becomes important later on. Before any of that debate about what should we target, he is enabling more aircraft to be able to target at any given time. And that's really, really important.
Why don't we take a quick break? We're in the North African heat. There's lots of aircraft being run around on trucks. Why don't we take a quick break, come back, and learn a bit more about his time in North Africa and then more broadly in the Middle East? Welcome back. So Tedder's another one of these fascinating characters. He's unusual because he is cross-branch. He spent time with the Royal Navy. He is already thinking about this new world of bombing. That was his basis in the First World War. But interestingly, rather than just put me in an aeroplane and point me at the enemy, he's also thinking very carefully about how do I make sure my fleet of aircraft, there are more of them on the ground than the Germans, and I can keep more of them in the air than the Germans. What happens next, Gareth?
So this is a really interesting bit, and I still haven't quite bottomed out what seems like a bit of a confliction, certainly in my mind, about Tedder, in that he is in command of Royal Air Force operations in support of North Africa. So this is Rommel versus Montgomery in the Western Desert, El Alamein et al. And he's credited with coming up with the tactic that gets known as the Tedder carpet. And it's effectively what we would now refer to as carpet bombing. And the reason that I find this slightly difficult is later on, he is really against. No, that's not the right word. He finds the balance between, and we'll come on to this when we talk about Operation Lord, the balance between tactical bombing in support of land operations, and in some cases amphibious and maritime operations, and strategic bombing, removing from the operational capability of the enemy their ability to even get to the fight. And famously, Bomber Harris has this idea of persistent and ubiquitous bombing of civilian populations across the industrial heartland of Germany to strategically win the war from the air. Now, this isn't a podcast to discuss air power and air strategy, but just to make the point that this is a conversation that has continued to go on for decades since about where the balance lies. What I find interesting is that El Alamein, Tedder is perhaps a part of the decisive capabilities that enable Montgomery to defeat Rommel. And part of this is the use of carpet bombing against very specific targets. And I think what's interesting, and I haven't really got to the bottom of, is how Tedder uses nuance to pick those targets. Because I think when you discuss tactical bombing in support of ground tactical operations or strategic bombing, the removal of a rail network or factories or coal or whatever it is to stop the system, there isn't a lot of nuance. And the argument very quickly becomes, well, we should do one or the other. And interestingly, I think Tedder has already worked out where the balance is and shows a huge amount of resourcefulness and flexibility in being able to veer and haul the use of air power in the context of the fight at the time, and can justify it to the commanders that he is supporting. He moves from North Africa to the Mediterranean, and this is the first time that Tedder works alongside Eisenhower. And I think Eisenhower recognizes the thoughtfulness of Tedder as an air commander, not just fighting against the system for greater roles of aircraft and for greater use of the Air Force, but is actually quite nuanced and balanced about how and when air power should be used to support ground operations and maritime operations, and where maritime operations should be used to support air operations. And it's almost as if he's not advocating for air power, he's advocating for joint use of capability. And I think this is where Eisenhower sees the brilliance of Arthur Tedder and clings on to him. And that's why Tedder follows Eisenhower to Operation Overlord and becomes the deputy commander.
So one of the things about Eisenhower is that he needs to be a warrior politician. It is an allied war where the British and the Americans need to work together. And one of the things that Eisenhower does very well is he manages the politics of working together. How much do you think is Tedder the right man for the job versus the right man with the British accent for the job versus the right accent for the job, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. So I think to be the right man for the job at that time, it needed, if the Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, Expeditionary Forces Europe is an American, then it almost has to be a Brit who's going to be the deputy commander. If it had been the other way around, if, for example, Montgomery had been commander-in-chief, then it would have had to have been an American. And I think that's where we see this the top level of military command butting up against grand strategy, butting up against political statecraft. These things overlap slightly, and there is a need when you're in a coalition, when you're an allied force, trying to cooperate and perhaps even integrate capabilities between nations, between countries' industrial complexes, between cultural nuanced differences in your opinions, in perhaps even differences in your outlook on the end state. You need to have a level of diplomacy. And I think this, again, is another string to Tedder's bow, because he's not only a brilliant strategist, a great warrior philosopher or academic or whatever you want to describe it as, a thinker in the material use of military capability, but he's also just a people person. He is a amiable diplomat who knows how to read a room and then work a room. And this is why Eisenhower picks him, because he fits the bill. He's a Brit. He's not Montgomery, and that's probably quite important, because at this point, this is where Eisenhower has risen to the top. It's the point where Eisenhower takes command, and it is clear that this is how this is going to be. But up until that point, Montgomery had been pushing to be Shafe, Commander Shafe. Montgomery is not the diplomat. Montgomery is arguably quite an irritable person, who is blunt, who is often crass and rude, and he's arrogant in his way of thinking. And we may well end up doing an influencers episode on Montgomery, because he's quite divisive as well, even to this day, where some people hold him up as a strategic genius, brilliant commander of ground forces in North Africa, in as part of Overlord, and throughout the liberation of Europe. And then other people hold him up as a divisive character who arguably is flawed in many, many ways. Montgomery and Tedder don't get on, probably because they're so different. Because Tedder is a thinker, he's subtle, he's amiable. And I'm not saying Montgomery's not a thinker, because I think he was, but he didn't have that soft, emotional intelligence that I think Tedder has.
Isn't it interesting that, none of this is surprising. If you wrote down and you said, to be a great war leader, and I know that's a poor term, to be a great war leader, you need the following skills. The reality is, as with any role in leadership, is you need to think about what kind of leadership you need, for what reason, and in what context. Because you've literally just said, you didn't literally say this, but I think the implication was very clearly there. If Montgomery had been the Supreme Allied Commander or Deputy Supreme Allied Commander, he probably would have annoyed more people than he brought with him. He would have been a divisive leader. And yet Montgomery and Patton, as the leaders of armies taking the fight to the battlefield, they are highly effective in that activity. And so there really is this sense of situational leadership, which means for different jobs, you need different people, and even different people at different times with different skills.
I think that's very fair. I also think there's a recognition here, or I certainly recognise here, that there is a difference between, and I'm talking a very military language, but I think it applies across any organisations. There's a difference between a tactical leader, an operational leader, and a strategic leader. So just for our listeners, to remind them or to bore them, because I talk about this a lot, tactics is the ability to use capability to achieve things. Strategy is the ability to orchestrate tactics, orchestrate the achievement of individual things in real time over a longer period of time under conditions of uncertainty to achieve organizational goals. And in between that is operational command, operational leadership, which in a military context is how you think about the system so that you can work out through your analysis of ends, ways, and means how to apply tactics in order to have the right effects that compound over time to achieve your strategic end state. And we've talked in the past about in fact, we've talked very recently about the fact that the German war machine was flawed by the fact that it was driven by this idea of wonder weapons. And they didn't think about building capabilities, bits of equipment that were sympathetic to the industrial complex, to the system, to the training, to the culture, etc., etc. If you're talking about targeting, and arguably in air power, much of what you're talking about is strike or bombing or using air power to deliver destructive effect, then you're at the operational level talking about what you're going to remove from the other person, the adversary, the competition's system. And it's really interesting because Bomber Harris, at the point where Eisenhower pulls Arthur Tedder to become Deputy Supreme Commander Europe, Bomber Harris is advocating for all-out carpet bombing of German industrial heartland, civilian populations, to break the will of the German people and to remove the labour force from the industrial capital that is supporting the war effort. Still a very, very contentious thing even to this day. The daylight and nighttime bombing raids that led to the firebombing of Dresden and all of that. On the other hand, you've got Montgomery, who in the planning for D-Day is advocating for the absolute use of air power to support the tactical land fight. As divisions are pushing over the beaches of Normandy, he wants bombers and strike capability from the air to be removing the tactical blockers, the divisions of armour, the fuel, the reinforcements, the reserves, to allow Montgomery and Patton to break through and achieve tactical success, which will have operational success, which will ultimately lead to the strategic success of liberating Europe. Tedder sits somewhere between the two, and he sees the value in a bit of both. And what I think brilliant about Tedder here is it's not the worst of both cases. It's not a compromise. It's the use of careful, balanced nuance to work out to what extent you can best utilize your capability to have the best effect on the enemy. And one of the things that he focuses really heavily on is the destruction of the rail network. And he says, if we destroy the rail network, it will have a twofold effect. We will be able to prevent the war machine from getting around, the maneuver ability to use rail to move fuel, supplies, ammunition, armoured vehicles quickly across Europe. We will also prevent the industrial system from working because they won't be able to move coal, oil, steel, food within the industrial heartland of the war machine of Nazi Germany. And it's really interesting because post-war, there is a rather critical analysis from an army 3-star general. I can't remember who it is, but talks about Tedder in a really quite disparaging way and says, well, what Tedder didn't really understand is even though they removed 80% of the rail network, the Wehrmacht was still able to move all of their armoured vehicles around with the 20% that was left. And that's a very operational to tactical view of what was trying to be achieved. And what was missed there was that Tedder wasn't trying to stop the army from moving tanks into France to resist the invasion. He also wasn't trying to break the will of the German people. He was trying to make the German system so stretched that it was pretty poor at both. And so he wasn't trying to solve the problem for Montgomery so that Montgomery didn't have to fight, and nor was he trying to win the war from the air. What he was trying to do was to create the best conditions so that the tactics Patton and Montgomery fighting through Normandy allows Eisenhower to achieve the strategic success of breaking the German war machine. And I think that is the epitome of why cheddar is that link between operational tactics and strategy.
I've always wondered, when you get to be a person like Tedder, who's surrounded by people who are very black and white, as you've described, who advises Tedder? Who is Tedder's support network when he says, "Have I got this right?" I don't know. It's an interesting one.
Yeah, I think it is an interesting one. I think like any senior leader, you are surrounded by your staff, so you have people that are on your staff to help you do an analysis of problems and help you come up with the plans and write the orders and all that sort of stuff. And then, of course, as you get more and more senior, you also have people who are there to make your life easier in terms of planning your diaries, bringing you cups of coffee and all of the stuff that allows you the time and the space to go and think about the problems. So in military planning, the orders are generally written by staff officers, and there'll be various experts within that staff who are used to writing their particular bit. So there'll be a logistics expert, there'll be a medical expert who'll talk about casualty evacuations or the medical aspects of whatever military plan. There'll be an intelligence staff that are advising you on what the enemy are likely to do in response and all of that kind of good stuff. And the job of a leader is to not worry about writing the orders, but to think about the problem. And we quite often we use the phrase sort of wet towel thinking, which is kind of this idea of the senior leader puts a wet towel around their head and goes and just thinks about the problem while everybody else is scrabbling to get these orders together in the right amount of time. And we're going to do an episode on how a problem is given to the military and they go through a planning process to come up with a plan. So we'll go into that in more detail. I think, so I don't know, but I would say Cheddar is going to have to rely on lots of expertise. There are very few commanders throughout history who know all the answers all the time. So I think there is always going to be a reliance on other people for answering questions, adding their advice, adding their guidance, adding their experience. But I think where Cheddar is brilliant is that, as we said, he's able to understand what is required in that strategic space and visualize what that means in terms of tactics. I think what the staff will then do is turn that into the timing synchronization matrices,
Of
how
course.
many aircraft you actually need, etc., etc.
I think we're also scrabbling a bit at this idea, which is as you become more senior, there are fewer and fewer people around you have opinions that you go, "Oh, that's interesting." And there's almost this thing. I mean, I do keep thinking about CEOs when how does the CEO know that I should be listening to those dissenting views versus I've got the right view? I don't know. It's a different conversation, but it is that interesting balance between having a conviction, a sense of purpose, and a confidence based on experience, but balanced with a curiosity and a willingness to listen to others. I just think that when you get to that level of the pyramid, it's almost a little bit harder because the biases are almost against you being collaborative in that way, because you are the leader. The buck stops with you. But
I think it does. But I think one of the things we've sort of seen throughout all of our influencers episodes and has come up in the wider podcast time and time again is just because you're a leader doesn't mean you have to have all the answers and be right all the time. And in fact, I would argue the more senior you become in any organization, the messier the problems, the less likely you are to just know what the answer is. Junior leaders are quite often dealing with tactics. So how do you apply capability to achieve things, well, you've probably seen those kind of problems before. So you have a really good sense of how to solve that problem. And quite often, junior leaders need to be the proactive people that lead from the front, get up and get things going, do things, motivate people to actually do stuff. I think as you become more operational, more strategic, the key success to leader is instilling confidence in the plan whilst also recognizing that you don't have all the answers. And it's that brilliant balance of getting people to collaborate on coming up with the solutions, having the vision to know what the shape of that solution looks like, but without all the details, and then having the interpersonal skills or the emotional capability to create the right relationships and the right culture that the organization thrives even when everything's a little bit uncertain.
I think we're going to come back to this in a different episode because I love the way you've described this recipe of things. And by the way, don't think I'm not going to attempt to use the phrase wet towel thinking, wet towel moment. Actually, if I say wet towel moment, that comes across wrong. Wet towel thing. Anyway, Tedder, let's get back to Second World War. We've had D-Day, incredibly successful, surprisingly successful, I think. We're now going through the campaign as the Allies start to move through France. Let's talk about what else he does.
Yeah, so it's interesting, isn't it? When we think about Operation Overlord, D-Day, and then we think about that sort of second half, if you like, the second half of the European match of the Second World War.
What second half? It's D-Day, and then Hitler's dead, right? That's almost what our modern thinking is.
The phony war, Battle of Britain, El Alamein, and the Mediterranean is sort of the first half, and then it's a suck of orange and a quick break, and then it's the invasion of mainland Europe through Overlord, all the way through to the culmination, of the collapse of the Nazi regime, and then we're into Berlin, and we'll come on to Berlin in a minute. We often think about Overlord in terms of tanks on the ground, Sherman tanks rolling over the bocage of Normandy. If you think about the film, you've got The Longest Day, Saving Private Ryan, those classic images, it's landing craft and tanks. We don't think about air power that much. And it's interesting. And the reason is air power wasn't used in a focused tactical way to support the divisions of soldiers landing on the beaches and breaking out of the landing points of Operation Overlord. Nor were they being used to break the will of the German people in the cities of Germany. They were being used, as we've already said, in that balanced way of breaking the system. And that's because Tedder knew what Eisenhower needed and very, very carefully balanced the need to do a little bit of tactical support. There was definitely air power, bombing, rear area support, artillery maneuver areas, ammunition depots, rail lines, bringing divisional armour in. There was that happening in northern France. But more of the air power was stopping that operational level German reinforcements moving out of Germany, moving from other bits of France and getting their way up to fighting the Allies coming south out of Normandy. So we think about Overlord and we think about the invasion of Europe as a very ground war. And the army really like to talk about avenues of approach and arrows on the map and talk about the divisions moving across Europe. So it's really interesting that the second in command was a Royal Air Force officer. But I think that speaks to the fact that Eisenhower had recognised his ability to think about things in a joint manner. And he recognised that Overlord and the subsequent operations were all about jointery. They were all about the supplies coming over the maritime flank. The war in the Atlantic was still ongoing, albeit we had had a relatively decisive effect against German U-boats. There was still a risk. There was still a war to be had in ensuring those logistical supply lines, getting that stuff out of England and across the English Channel into France, and then the logistical fight of moving stuff through Western Europe. And we talked when we talked about the Battle of the Bulge and Joachim Piper and all of that stuff about the gargantuan effort to get the logistical stores across Western Europe. And that's where Cheddar's experience in the Middle East was really, really valuable. Because it doesn't matter whether you're talking about moving aircraft parts or whether you're talking about fuel, aviation fuel for aircraft and bombs for aircraft, or whether you're talking about shells for artillery, fuel for trucks and tanks, and tank parts. It's still the same logistical challenge. And he had a really built the experience to be able to support the operational level decision making and recognize where the weight of effort needed to be. So much so that when the Battle of the Bulge happened, and we've talked about this, the Allies were able to respond very, very quickly because at the operational level, they knew their logistical system. What's also really interesting, I think, is we talked a little bit earlier about the fact that Cheddar is interpersonal skills are really, really good. And I made the comparison with Montgomery, who is perhaps a little bit brash, rude almost. And whilst arguably a brilliant tactician and a great wartime leader in his own right, didn't have the ability to build the relationships with flanking formations and with higher command. And I think we talked about this with the Battle of the Bulge episode. He actually alienated himself and caused a lot of damage between the US and the Brits by trying to take credit and claim a much greater role of command in the Battle of the Bulge. Cheddar, on the other hand, was actually quietly working away in the background, bringing people together, and Eisenhower recognized that, so much so that it was Eisenhower's recommendation to Roosevelt that it would be Cheddar that went to go and talk about the post-war peace situation with the Russians, because he recognized this was a guy who was good at interpersonal skills. So not a recognizable ground combat leader, but Eisenhower chose him to go and talk to the Russians. Before that, though, it was Arthur Tedder, and I don't know exactly why and why it wasn't Eisenhower, but it was Arthur Tedder that actually accepted the German surrender.
We're coming a little bit towards the end, and obviously we should talk a little bit about his sort of legacy in post-war, but I'm pretty staggered. You and I both are reasonably familiar with the Second World War and the leaders around it. I still can't believe he's the person that I bet if you asked most people who know about the Second World War, he comes at the bottom of the list of the people who know about. Given what you have said, he is the deputy commander of Allied forces in Europe. That is he is the most senior British military officer in the Allied armies. He is the person who takes the surrender personally. He has all. I don't know, and I'm trying to get my head around this. Why is it we don't know about him? And maybe it's because history loves the people who are the warriors and the gladiators at the front, and yet it does seem to me. I'm almost cheating. I'm getting to the end before we're at the end. What seems to me to be his magic ingredient is his ability to mix the strategic and the operational. in a way that if you look at lots of other military influencers, they seem to be better at one rather than the other. So we talk about Rommel. We say, well, yes, he can do both a bit, but really he's more operational than anything else. It seems that Ted has got this interesting balance. And I just wonder, and maybe this is true of people in the civilian world, if you're the strategic guy, it's just not as exciting as the guy who stands up in front of the press. It's not as exciting as the guy that stands up in front of the tactical team and says, come on, guys, we can do it. And yet it is such a supremely important job.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think part of that is there's no taking away from the fact that Arthur Tedder was a courageous fighter pilot and then bomber pilot in the First World War. So you can't say, he was a rear echelon planner, he's a bureaucrat. He's proved his mettle in combat. He joined the infantry. He wanted to fight. But I just think as an air commander coming up through the ranks of the Air Force, there's only ever going to be photos of you looking at maps.
Yeah,
Because
not glamorous, not glamorous.
as soon as you've stopped climbing into aircraft, the only photos are going to be of you looking at air charts and maps and pointing with a big stick, probably with some amazing moustache. Whereas even Patton and Montgomery, there's pictures of them at the front lines with soldiers sitting on tanks. So I guess in the wartime memory, the planners get forgotten about, and the war fighters, in air quotes, are the people that get really remembered.
I wonder whether that's any different and also respected as well.
Yeah.
We're coming towards the end. Here's a question that sort of struck me, and I'm almost nervous about asking the question because I don't want the answer to be a negative one. But the fact that I don't know much about Tedder, what was his legacy? So what did he change? Was he an amazing leader at the time doing that job in a way that it had to be done? Or do you think he has a legacy where whether people know it's Tedder or not, since then, the way people have done things has evolved and developed, perhaps in a way that it wouldn't have done if Tedder hadn't done it first?
I absolutely think his fingerprints are all over the structure of the Royal Air Force today, and how Western forces more generally, US Air Force, NATO allies, air power is received as part of the combined arms joint operations, even to this day. Interestingly, though, he also was one of the key architects of the Berlin airlift. He reorganized the Royal Air Force post Second World War, so massive demobilizations and downscaling, and he was the one who advocated for the Air Force to actually grow in size when other bits of UK defence were shrinking quite rapidly. And he structured the Air Force, or restructured the Air Force, from a wartime Air Force ready to fight as part of the Allies in Europe to an Air Force fit for the Cold War. He went on to be, I think, one of the board members of the BBC. He was the Vice Chancellor of Cambridge University. He wrote a very influential history of the Royal Navy. And he wrote a very influential, he gave a lecture that was published on air power. And that became the seed corn or foundational document from which the modern debate about the role of air power in conflict started. So I think, and not least, of course, his name is now attached to the Leadership Academy of the Royal Air Force at Cranwell, where we were only a few weeks ago. So I think a hugely underrated wartime leader, but one that left a huge influence on both thoughts around strategic leadership and thoughts around the way that joint operations and air power still work to this day.
I love the idea that there are still these influencers that we can go out and learn more about. I'm smiling even as I'm saying this. I need to go away and read more about Tedder. It strikes me there is an untapped seam of gold there in terms of, we talk about Montgomery, we talk about Rommel and all these other leaders that we've talked about in the past. I suspect there's a lot more. And the thing, maybe one last observation from me is Tedder 80 years ago was talking about a world which is extraordinarily recognizable today in terms of joint warfare between services, between the importance of maneuver. He was doing things which then would have seemed new and groundbreaking, but now is considered bread and butter. And you can draw the direct line between the two. So fascinating. Well, thank you for that, Gareth. I know we say this every week, but we do this podcast probably more for ourselves than from anyone else because we get to learn this stuff and you get to hear. So thank you for leading that one, Gareth. I'm going to cheat. I'm thinking about the next influencer, and I am specifically not going to tell Gareth who it is. So it's an interesting surprise for him on the day, because normally we know who we're going to do as we go in. So I'm going to this is more to warm Gareth up to the idea that whatever he says, I'm not actually going to tell him, and it'll be a surprise on the day. But for now, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope we shone a light on someone perhaps you wouldn't have heard of at least as much before. And there are some interesting lessons through there that we can take away. If you have enjoyed this episode and you've listened to previous episodes, you know exactly what I'm going to say next. We are available on battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. If you want to email us, please tell us what you like, what you don't like. Ask us questions. Give us some new influencers that we can go away and do a bit of research on and come back and talk about. But the engagement is really valuable for us, and we love hearing from people. We're available on Battling with Biz with a Z, both on Blue Sky and Twitter. And we are also, I think both myself and Gareth, we post on LinkedIn as well whenever we have new episodes. But please, we love to hear from you. Let us know what you think. If you have listened to this episode, and maybe this is the first time you've found us, or you've heard a couple of episodes, we have a large back catalogue of episodes that we have really enjoyed doing. And the reality is every episode we do, we touch on 100 other episodes we've done. So please go have a look at our back catalogue. And finally, if you haven't already subscribed, please do on whatever podcast platform you use. Hit subscribe, and every Thursday you will get an episode either of the Influencers, which we do once a month, or a standard episode of Battling with Business. But for now, thank you for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we will see you soon on Battling with Business.
Thanks very much. Cheerio.